We never should have drilled there. That's the long and short of it. If we just stuck to the original specs approved 3 months ago, we have pumped the old sector full of grout, capped it, and moved on to the next decommission job. But the client, in this case, a Department of Energy subcontractor, whose name is buried under so many NDAs I can't even whisper it, changed the work order at the 11th hour. My name is Jack Miller. I was a senior project engineer for a remediation firm, the kind of company that gets called in to clean up America's Cold War hangover. Our current gig was out at the Nevada National Security Site, a massive, sun-bleached scar on the desert north of Vegas, a place haunted by the ghosts of atomic tests. For decades, this was where the U.S. government learned how to split the atom and what happens when you do. Now, it's one of the most restricted and complex environmental cleanup zones in the country. Our job was a tiny piece of that puzzle. We were tasked with demolishing and entombing old surface structures, mostly Cold War-era communications bunkers not directly tied to the nuclear tests. It was grunt work, mostly breaking up concrete and rebar. And that's exactly what we were doing in early October of 2023. Our target was an old communications relay hub, or what was left of it. The schematic showed a series of underground concrete corridors and equipment rooms, all slated to be filled with a specialized, high-density concrete slurry. We started drilling the injection holes. The first 6 went smooth as glass. The rig would bite through the desert hardpan, chew through the old concrete, and the monitoring software would signal we'd hit the target depth. But on borehole number 7, the day went sideways. "Jack, get over to the number 7 rig." "Got something weird," crackled the voice of our foreman, a guy named Dave, over the radio. I drove my F-150 over. The drill was idle. On the operator's tough book, pressure and density gauges were flashing red. "What's the problem?" I asked. "Punched through the topsoil, hit the concrete slab like we expected," Dave said, tapping the screen. "Drilled through 4 feet of reinforced concrete, and then nothing. Total loss of resistance. Like there's a cavern under the slab." That made no sense. According to every blueprint we'd pulled from federal archives, it was supposed to be compacted fill, and then solid bedrock under that slab. No voids. A washout, maybe? A sinkhole? I offered. Dave shook his head, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Nah, the pressure drop was instantaneous, like punching through a plaster wall. And look at this. He pointed to the acoustic sounder data. The pings were bouncing off something hard and flat about 30 feet below our drill bit. Between us and that surface was nothing but air. "All right, shut it all down," I ordered. "We don't do a thing until we know what we're looking at." I got on the phone with my project manager, a straight-laced, by-the-book guy named Henderson who hated 2 things above all else: surprises and cost overruns. This was shaping up to be both. He was on site in 20 minutes, his face already a thundercloud. I walked him through it. "A void," he repeated, incredulous. "Can't be. I personally reviewed the DOD plans from the 70s. It's solid earth." "Well, something's down there," I said, "and it's big. A 30-foot-high ceiling, if you believe the sounder." Henderson stared at the blueprint spread on the hood of his truck, then at the silent rig, then at the dusty ground. "Get the survey team out here. I want a full ground-penetrating radar scan of this grid. I want to know how big this thing is. And not a word of this outside our immediate team. You understand?" "Understood," I said. The GPR crew worked until dusk. Their findings were baffling. Beneath our feet, at a depth of about 12 feet, was a massive man-made structure. It wasn't just a void, it was the top of an enormous box. A perfect rectangle, measuring about 100 by 200 feet. The walls plunged down at least 30 feet, which was a maximum depth their gear could reliably penetrate. The structure was hermetically sealed. And most importantly, it didn't exist on any official records. Not on Atomic Energy Commission maps from the 60s, not on the military engineering plans from the 70s, not in any modern federal land registry. It was a ghost made of concrete and steel. When Henderson saw the GPR report, the color drained from his face. He spent the next few hours locked in his portable office, making a series of hushed, intense phone calls. By the next morning, the site was on lockdown. It wasn't our usual DOE liaisons who showed up. It was a different breed of men in dark, unseasonable suits, with stony faces and credentials that made my boss's boss snap to attention. We, the contractors, were ordered to pull back to a safe perimeter. A heavy silence fell over the work site. We sat in our temporary camp, watching as unfamiliar, high-tech equipment was trucked in. Then, Henderson and I were summoned to a meeting. Inside one of the new, blacked, out-command trailers sat a man in his 50s. He introduced himself only as Mr. Davison. He didn't say which three-letter agency he worked for. Mr. Henderson, Mr. Miller, he began, his voice calm and devoid of preamble. We've reviewed your data. We have also cross-referenced archives to which you do not and will not have access. This facility is not documented. Officially, it doesn't exist. He let that hang in the air-conditioned quiet. Therefore, he continued, we need to find out what is, and you're going to help us. Your task is to breach the structure with surgical precision. We want access with minimal structural damage. Henderson started protest, citing OSHA regulations and unknown hazards. Mr. Henderson, Davison cut him off, his voice dropping to an icy calm that was more menacing than shouting. Your regulations are not the authority here. You will follow our instructions. Your team has the plasma cutters and diamond wire saws we require. You will cut an opening right here. He tapped a spot on a freshly printed GPR schematic, 6 by 6 feet. The slab is 4 feet thick. Begin. The next 24 hours were a blur of the high-pitched scream of plasma arcs and the grinding of industrial saws. We worked in full level C hazmat gear. Even though our Geiger counter stayed stubbornly silent, Davison's men, a quiet, watchful presence, observed every move. Finally, a massive 6 by 6 foot plug of concrete was cut free. A heavy lift crane strained, then pulled it loose. Beneath it was a layer of thick, dull lead sheeting, and under the lead was a plate of pristine, polished steel. Not a spot of rust. The weld seams were flawless, inhumanly perfect. Set in the center of the plate was a massive hatch, like one on a naval submarine, but with no will to turn it. In its place was an intricate, multi-layered lock mechanism that looked like it was designed never to be opened from the outside. Davison's team brought in their own specialist, a quiet older man with a briefcase full of tools that looked more like a watchmaker's than a locksmith's. He worked on the lock for hours. We could only stand back and watch his silent, meticulous labor. At last, a deep thunk echoed from the steel plate. The specialist stepped back, giving Davison a slight nod. A loud hiss erupted from the hatch's seam. The pressure inside was higher than our own atmosphere. The hissing went on for a full minute. When it stopped, a strange odor filled the air, sterile and antiseptic, with sharp undertone of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. It wasn't the smell of decay or stale, trapped air you'd expect from a place sealed for decades. It was the smell of a machine that was still running. Two of Davison's men, clad in heavy, self-contained EOD suits, struggled to heave the heavy steel hatch open. They shined high-lumen flashlights down into the opening. A vertical steel ladder descended into perfect darkness. Air quality check, Davison commanded. The specialist lowered a multi-gas analyzer on a long cable. After a few minutes, he pulled it up and read the display. Atmosphere is viable. 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, trace argon. CO2 levels are nominal. Background radiation is 0. No biological or chemical agents detected. Sir, the air down there is cleaner than is up here. Davison nodded. We're going in. Henderson and I were to accompany them as technical consultants. We were handed N95 masks and flashlights. A 4-man team of what looked like special operators went first, followed by Davison, then us. The stainless steel ladder dropped about 30 feet onto a small landing in front of another airtight door, identical to one above, but this one stood slightly ajar. Beyond it was a long, straight corridor. The walls, floor, and ceiling were constructed of smooth, seamless, light gray panels. The light was dim but uniform, seeming to emanate from the ceiling itself with no visible fixtures. And we could hear it, a low, constant hum, the unmistakable sound of an active ventilation system. We moved forward, our bootsteps the only sharp sound in the humming silence. The corridor ran for about 150 feet before ending at a wall of thick smoked glass. Behind the glass was a room. As we drew closer, our flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating what was inside, and we all stopped dead. There were people in there, 7 of them, 4 men, 3 women, all dressed in simple gray, form-fitting jumpsuits with no markings. One man sat on a plain metal stool in the center of the room. Another stood near the far wall, one hand resting flat against it. One woman sat on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees. The others were simply standing, scattered throughout the space. They weren't moving. They were staring not at us, but through us, their eyes fixed on the glass wall with an empty, unfocused gaze. They looked like hyper-realistic exhibits in a wax museum. Their skin was pale, but not in a sickly way. Their hair was cut uniformly short. They appeared to be anywhere from 30 to 50 years old. "They're alive," Henderson whispered, his voice cracking. No one replied. We just stared at them, and they stared into nothing. Davison raised a small radio to his lips. "Command, this is Apex. We have visual on 7 subjects. They appear viable. Chamber is sealed. I need the medical response team on site. Now!" While we waited, we examined the wall beside the glass. It had a series of narrow slots, like deposit boxes at a bank. Through one, we could see the edge of a metal container that looked like a military-issue meal tray. The life support hum was slightly louder here. The system was active. Someone or something had been feeding and providing air to these people for how long? The medical team arrived half an hour later, led by a doctor named Ben Carter, a brisk, energetic man in his 40s. He and his assistant, also in full PP, started setting up diagnostic equipment near the glass. Davison instructed them not to attempt a breach, only to conduct a remote visual assessment. Dr. Carter pressed close to the glass, shining a bright diagnostic penlight into the room, examining each occupant. "No visible signs of muscular atrophy," he murmured. His voice piped through his suit's external speaker. "Integument appears normal. No signs of malnutrition. Pupils are fixed. No reaction to light. Hold on." He focused the beam on the face of the woman, sitting on the floor. She slowly, languidly blinked once. "They're definitely alive," Carter said, his voice louder now, in some kind of catatonic or deep trance state. "We have to get blood panels, run an EEG." It was at that exact moment that the strange situation spiraled into a waking nightmare. One of the figures, the man who had been standing motionlessly at the far wall, slowly turned his head. The movement was fluid, unnaturally so. He didn't turn toward the doctor. He turned slightly, his gaze landing directly on the doctor's young assistant, a kid who was standing a few feet behind Carter, holding a medical case. The kid froze. We all froze. The man behind the glass opened his mouth. From hidden speakers somewhere in the corridor, a voice emerged. It was quiet but perfectly clear, utterly devoid of inflection or emotion. A synthesized mechanical voice. "Liam," it said. The assistant's name was Liam. None of us had spoken his name down here. He was just one of a dozen new support staff flown in for this operation. I'd never seen him before in my life. Liam dropped the medical case. Instruments clattered and scattered across the smooth floor. He started to hyperventilate, his eyes bugging out in sheer terror. He couldn't, the kid choked out. No one knows my name." He stumbled backward, tripped over his own feet, and collapsed in a full-blown panic attack. He was screaming, clawing his mask at his own face. He couldn't know. No one could know. Dr. Carter and the soldiers rushed to him, trying to restrain and sedate him. Davison grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Everyone out. Now. Seal the primary hatch. Move." We scrambled back down the humming corridor, Liam's hysterical screams echoing behind us. The last thing I saw as I glanced back was 7 motionless figures behind the glass. The man who had spoken had already turned his head back to its original position, staring into the void as if nothing had ever happened. That night, Our entire contracting operation was terminated. We were all sent home, but not before signing a stack of NDAs so intimidating, with threats invoking the Patriot Act and national security, that Henderson's hands were visibly shaking as he signed. That was day one. Back then, we still thought there might be a rational, terrestrial explanation for it all. We were catastrophically wrong. This was just the beginning. Part 2. The next 2 weeks were a fog of low-grade, gnawing anxiety. I was back in my apartment in Henderson, Nevada, but my mind was still in that sterile, underground corridor. The company put my whole crew on paid administrative leave. The official story for the rest of the firm was a project reassessment due to unforeseen geological complications. A neat, tidy lie. Those of us who went down into the bunker got a separate, more severe briefing. The documents we signed essentially classified our memories as state secrets. We couldn't talk about it with our families, our friends, or even each other. Any breach would be treated as an act of espionage. I tried to go through the motions of a normal life, grocery shopping, watching football, fielding calls from my sister in Phoenix. But it all felt like a cheap movie set. My thoughts kept replaying that moment. Liam, how could that thing have known his name? I ran through the possibilities. A name tag on a suit? No. The PP was generic, unmarked. Had Liam said his own name when we entered? No. We were under strict comm silence. Every logical explanation fell apart. All that was left was the impossible, terrifying fact at the center of it all. They knew. They knew who we were on the other side of that glass. That single fact changed everything. They weren't just passive subjects in an old experiment. They were something else entirely. I barely slept. When I did, my dreams were filled with gray jumpsuits and vacant, unfocused eyes. I'd wake up convinced I could hear a low-frequency hum vibrating through the walls of my apartment. The same hum from the bunker's ventilation system. I started to question my own sanity. Maybe it was a neurotoxin, some airborne agent their advanced sensors had missed. That felt more plausible than the reality of what we'd seen. On the 15th day, my phone rang. The caller ID was unknown. The voice was crisp, professional, and unfamiliar. Mr. Miller, this is Project Oversight from Nevada site. You are required to return to the facility. A vehicle will be at your residence in 1 hour. It wasn't a request. My team, I started to say, no. The voice cut me off. Just you. Bring nothing. You will be provided for. The line went dead. An hour later, a black, government plate Chevy Suburban was waiting at my curb. The drive back out to the desert was made in absolute silence. When we arrived, the place was unrecognizable. Our humble contractor's camp was gone. In its place stood a full-blown, self-contained forward operating base. The perimeter fence had been pushed out by a mile and was now patrolled by armed military personnel. The landscape was dotted with temporary modular buildings, mobile labs, and satellite communication arrays. This wasn't a cleanup site anymore. It looked like a first contact scenario or a crash recovery zone. I was escorted to the same command trailer where I'd first met Davison. He was there, hunched over a table buried in schematics and data printouts. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 weeks. With him were 2 other people, a woman in a lab coat who looked sharp and exhausted, and a man in an Air Force uniform with the eagles of a full colonel on his shoulders. Jack, Davison said, dispensing with the formalities, thanks for your promptness. This is Dr. Evelyn Reed, our lead scientific analyst, and this is Colonel Matthews. He's in charge of site security. Sit down. I sat. The air in the trailer was thick with tension. We need your expertise, Davison continued. You're a structural engineer. You understand how things are built, and by extension, how they come apart. We're up against something we can't seem to crack with force or with science. What's happened since I left? I asked. A great deal, Dr. Reed spoke up. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of profound fatigue. We've spent 2 weeks studying the chamber. We've established a few key facts. Fact 1. The life support system is entirely self-contained. Air, nutrient delivery, waste recycling. It's a closed-loop biome. We can't find any power conduits or plumbing leading out of it. We don't know what's powering it. The nutrient paste they're fed is a perfectly engineered substance designed to maintain human life with near zero physical activity. She paused, her eyes locking onto mine. Fact 2, and this is the crucial part. We ran carbon dating on organic particulates from the air filtration system and thermoluminescence dating on the concrete plug you removed. We know when that chamber was sealed. She let the silence stretch. 1974, give or take a few months. I just sat there, the date echoing in my skull. 1974. Seamless panel construction, ambient panel lighting, a self-sustaining biosphere that could run flawlessly for 50 years? That technology didn't exist then, not in the unclassified world. Anyway, we've scoured every Black Project archive there is. Colonel Matthews added, his voice a low gravel. Projects from the DoD, CIA, DARPA, the old Atomic Energy Commission. There is not one shred of evidence that anything of this nature was ever constructed in this sector. This facility is a ghost. It was never built. And the people inside? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Unresponsive. Davison said, "We've tried everything. Audio signals across the spectrum. Strobing lights. We broadcast a direct appeal from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Nothing. They just are. They eat when food is dispensed. They sometimes move slowly around the room. They sleep, either standing up or sitting down. Their vital signs are as steady as a Mercury astronaut's, with one major exception." He glanced at Dr. Reed. "The psychological projection," she said. "Any personnel spending more than 2 hours near the observation window report effects, migraines, vertigo, auditory hallucinations. They claim they can hear whispering. 3 of our top analysts developed acute paranoia and had to be medically evacuated. Liam, the medical assistant, remains in a non-communicative state. He just occasionally repeats one word. Inside. We can't determine the source. Infrasound, a focused EM field, or something entirely outside our understanding. So, we made the call to extract them," Davison concluded. "But we hit a wall, a literal one. We can't get in. That glass partition is effectively indestructible. Diamond-tipped drills skate off it. Plasma cutters die when they get close. Any sophisticated electronics brought within 10 feet of its short out. It's not just strong material. It's an active defense system." And then I understood. "You want me to find a back door?" I said. "Precisely," Davison confirmed. "You were the first engineer to lay eyes on that corridor. You think in terms of structure and systems. We want you to go back down, examine every inch of that construction. Vent shafts, panel seams, floor plates. Find a vulnerability. We need to bypass that glass wall." An hour later, I was going down that same ladder. This time, 2 of Colonel Matthews' airmen followed, armed and keeping a respectful distance. The humming corridor felt just as sterile, the light just as dim. At the far end, the observation room was dark, the interior lights having been cut to minimize whatever effect it was projecting. I started my work. I used a sonic hammer to tap every panel, listening for any change in resonance that might indicate a hollow space. It was all solid. I examined the seams with a magnifying scope. They were practically non-existent, fused at molecular level. I felt like a bug crawling on a solid block of alien technology. My attention kept coming back to the ventilation grates near the floor, spaced every 20 feet. They were made of the same seamless gray material. I tried the bolts on one with a wrench. To my surprise, they turned. Behind the grate was a pristine, rectangular air duct disappearing into the wall. I radioed for a technician from the surface. He brought down a flexible borescope, a fiber optic cable with a camera on the end. "Let's take a look," I said. We fed the camera into the duct. On the small monitor, we saw perfectly smooth, dust-free walls. We pushed the cable deeper. The shaft ran straight, then made a clean 90-degree turn upward. We navigated the turn. The view remained the same, an empty, sterile tunnel. We pushed another 10 feet, and then something, sitting right in the middle of the duct, was a small object, It was a perfect cube, about 1 inch on each side, made of a dark, non-reflective, matte black metal. It wasn't debris. It was placed. What in the world? The technician breathed. I have no idea, I said, squinting at the screen. It didn't belong. In a system this clean, nothing was accidental. As we stared, trying to make sense of it, the cube on the screen gave a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch, and then slowly, with impossible smoothness, it rotated itself 45 degrees. On its own, ice flooded my veins. Did you see that? The tech whispered. I didn't get a chance to answer. One of the airmen behind me let out a sharp, quiet curse. Sir, you need to look. I turned and looked down the long corridor toward the dark glass. I couldn't see a thing, but the airman was looking through a set of night vision goggles. He handed them to me. The darkness behind the glass resolved into a grainy, green-hued world. 6 of the figures were in the same positions as before, utterly still. But the 7th figure, the woman who had been sitting on the floor, was now standing. She had walked to the glass and was standing directly opposite our position in the hallway. She had raised her right hand, her palm pressed flat against the invisible barrier. Her face was a mass of placid emptiness, but her eyes, even through the distorting green of the NVGs, were locked directly on me. She wasn't just looking into the corridor. She was looking at me. At that exact instant, the cube in the vent rotated again. A new hum started in my ears, deeper than the ambient noise of the vents, a low, vibrating thrum that made my teeth ache and my stomach churn. Pull back, I ordered, my voice tight. We're leaving, right now. We ascended quickly. The moment my head cleared the hatch into the open desert air, the deep hum vanished. I reported everything to Davison, my voice shaking slightly. He listened without a word, his face an unreadable granite slab. Up until that moment, we were the observers, studying a bizarre anomaly. But in that corridor, I understood with chilling certainty. The anomaly had begun studying us, and it was making the rules now. Part 3. It was 3 a.m. in the command trailer. The air was stale with coffee and tension. I had just finished my debrief, laying out every detail for Davison, Dr. Reed, and Colonel Matthews. The cube in the vent, its autonomous movement, the woman at the glass. When I finished, a heavy silence settled over the small room. She was looking at you, Colonel Matthews stated, his gaze sharp, not at my airman, not just into the corridor. At you, specifically. You're certain of that? Positive, I said. It was focused, intentional, like she knew who was running the show down there. And her movement coincided precisely with the object's rotation in the duct. Dr. Reed mused, her pen flying across a notepad, sketching diagrams and flowcharts. That's not a coincidence. That's a coordinated response. They're showing us. They're showing us they have control not just of their chamber, but of the systems outside of it. That cube, it's a node, a sensor, a manipulator, or both. We have to retrieve it, Davison said, his voice hard. The exhaustion had been burned away by a raw, new intensity. It's the first tangible piece of their technology we can physically access. Evelyn, what's the risk? The risk is unquantifiable, Dr. Reed replied without looking up. The response would be anything from benign neglect to catastrophic aggression. They could interpret it as an attack. On the other hand, if we don't get it, we remain in the dark, poking at a black box. We're getting it, Davison decided, ending the discussion. Jack, I need a plan. How do we get that thing out of the vent? I want it done fast, remotely, and with zero human exposure. A robotic manipulator, I said after a moment, like an EOD robot, but more flexible. A snake arm with a camera and a gripper. We can feed it through the same duct. The main challenge will be the distance and the 90-degree bend. Get whatever you need, Davison ordered. You have carte blanche. Colonel, give him your best robotics techs. I want that object on a lab bench by sunrise. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. Matthews' technicians, 2 young but brilliant Air Force sergeants, brought out several EOD bots. We settled on an advanced model with a segmented, serpentine arm that could navigate tight corners. We spent hours modifying it, adding more powerful lights and multiple camera angles. As we worked in the floodlit hangar, I could feel the eyes of the base personnel on me. I was no longer just some contractor. I was a guy who'd found something, the guy the thing in the box was looking at. On an isolated, paranoid base like this, rumors spread like a contagion. I heard whispers about Liam, the medtech who was still catatonic, about the other scientists who'd been shipped out, about the disembodied voices some people swore they were hearing, even on the surface. By 0600, we were ready. We descended into the corridor again. The atmosphere was different now, heavy with anticipation. The corridor was lined with new sensors. A team of scientists sat at mobile workstations near the entrance, their faces illuminated by the glow of a dozen monitors. We set up the snake bot at the ventilation grate. I took the controls, the main view from the bot's primary camera filling a large monitor in front of me. I carefully guided the arm into the duct. The smooth metallic walls slid by, the 90-degree turn. 10 more feet, and there it was, the dark cube sitting motionless. Visual contact confirmed. I set into my headset. My voice piped to Davison and Reed in the command trailer. Proceed with retrieval, Jack. Davison's voice replied in my ear. Easy does it. I extended the pincer-like gripper at the end of the arm. The metal fingers opened slowly above the cube. I could feel a bead of sweat trace a path down my spine. My focus was locked on the screen, but out of the corner of my eye, I was acutely aware of the dark glass wall at the end of the hall. I knew they were watching. I began to lower the gripper. Stop. Dr. Reed's voice cut in sharply. Jack, hold position. We have activity. I froze, my fingers hovering over the joystick. What is it? Davison's voice demanded. Subject is moving. The male who was seated on the stool. He's on his feet. I couldn't resist. I glanced up from my console. One of the scientists had patched the night vision feed to a large wall-mounted monitor. The man in the gray jumpsuit was standing. He walked slowly, almost casually, to the side wall of his chamber, not the glass wall facing us, but the one to his right. He placed both of his palms flat against its smooth surface and stood there motionless, as if listening to the wall itself. Proceed, Jack, Davison ordered after a tense moment. Slowly, I returned my attention to the controls. The gripper was now an inch from the cube. I nudged the joystick. The metal fingers closed around the object. The instant the gripper made contact, 3 things happened at once. First, the ambient light in the corridor flickered violently and died, plunging us into darkness for a full second. The emergency lights on our gear flared to life. Then the main lighting came back on, but it had changed. It was dimmer and tinged with faint but definite crimson hue. Second, a single, sharp crack exploded from the corridor's hidden speakers. It sounded like a massive static discharge, loud enough to make one of the scientists yelp in pain. Third, and most bizarrely, was what happened on my monitor. The cube was secure in the gripper, but on the floor of the duct beneath it, where it had been resting, a thin, hair-like line had been etched into metal, glowing faintly for a second before fading. A perfect scratch, as if the cube had burned its impression into the very alloy of the duct. What the hell was that? Colonel Matthews yelled over the comms. Massive EM pulse, sir, a technician reported. Origin unknown. The whole base grid just blinked. I've got it, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline hammering in my chest. The object is secure. Beginning extraction. I slowly reversed the manipulator arm. On the monitor showing the chamber, the man at the wall was now joined by another. The woman who had been standing in the corner had walked over and stood beside him, placing her hands on the wall in the same manner. They stood together, like 2 people trying to hold a door shut against immense pressure. The 5-minute extraction felt like an hour. Finally, the bot's head emerged from the grate. A technician wearing thick, lead-lined gloves carefully received the cube and placed it into a sealed containment box. Mission complete. When we surfaced, the sun was just beginning to crest the mountains. The container was rushed to Dr. Reed's mobile lab. The rest of us were sent for another round of medical and psych evaluations. The initial report on the cube came back by noon. It was both astounding and completely unhelpful. The object was composed of a tungsten osmium alloy, but its crystal lattice was arranged in a structure that materials science said was physically impossible. It was a single, seamless, monolithic object. It emitted no detectable radiation, no magnetic field, and had no discernible power source. At room temperature, it felt unnaturally cold, actively leaching heat from its surroundings. It was, for all intents and purposes, a dead, inert lump of exotic metal. But we knew it wasn't dead. By that evening, the base was on edge. The glitches started. Small, strange things. The base's secure intranet went down for an hour. The water purification system threw an error, and the tap water briefly ran with metallic taste. The GPS in several of the security vehicles went haywire, showing their location as the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Matthews tried to blame it on the morning's EM pulse, but it was too much, too coincidental. I was in my assigned module, trying to make sense of my schematics. I kept coming back to the ventilation shafts. They seemed architecturally redundant for a closed system. On a fresh sheet of paper, I started mapping their locations. I drew in all the known access points from our initial survey, and then I saw it. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, a perfect, symmetrical, geometric pattern. It didn't look like a ventilation system. It looked like a circuit board, a massive buried circuit board, with our corridor as a single trace and the chamber as its central processor. And then another cold realization hit me. We had only opened one duct. There were over a dozen. What if each one had a cube? What if we had just pulled one tiny resistor from a vast, unknowable machine? I grabbed my sketches and ran out of my module, heading for Davison's command trailer. I had to show him. As I passed the medical tent, the flap opened. They were leading out one of the scientists who had been in the corridor with me that morning. He was pale, his eyes were vacant, and he was muttering to himself. As he passed, I heard the words clearly. "It's in the walls," he whispered over and over. "It's in the walls." I stopped in my tracks. His words, Kevin's word, inside. It all clicked in a way that made me feel sick. Before I reached the trailer, I looked up. The sky was a deep, bruised crimson from the setting sun, the same unsettling color that now filled the corridor below. I glanced at my hand, and for a terrifying second, my skin looked as pale and waxy as the people behind the glass. I blinked hard, and the illusion vanished, but a cold, sticky dread remained. We thought we had taken a piece of their world to study. But what if, in doing so, we had opened a door for a piece of their world to seep into ours? Suddenly, an alarm blared across the base. It wasn't a fire alarm or the attack siren. It was a deep, guttural, continuous roar I'd never heard before. People spilled out of their modules, panicked and confused. Colonel Matthews' voice, distorted by static, blasted from the PA system. "All personnel, this is not a drill. Stand fast. We have an unscheduled, unauthorized activation of the primary interior hatch." I spun around and looked toward the work site, where red emergency strobes were now flashing. The primary interior hatch. The heavy steel door at the bottom of the ladder. I knew instantly what it meant. The system was done playing defense. It had just locked us out. It was cutting us off from its inner sanctum. Or, a far more terrifying thought, it was locking us out here with the piece we had stolen. Part 4. The roaring siren died as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a pressure in my ears. Colonel Matthews' voice continued to bark orders over the PA system, placing the entire facility under a hard lockdown. No one in, no one out. I sprinted to the command post by the entrance to the bunker. It was a scene of controlled chaos. Engineers and airmen were crowded around the monitors, displaying the live feed from the camera we'd left on the landing below. It showed exactly what Matthews had announced. The massive airtight door, which had been open for our entire operation, was now sealed shut. It looked as if it had been forged as a single piece with the wall. "Status," Davison demanded, appearing at my shoulder. "It just closed, sir," a young engineer stammered, unable to tear his eyes from the screen. No warning. The drive mechanism activated from the inside. There are no external controls. We're locked out. "Try cutting it," Davison commanded, Two men in EOD suits carefully made their way down the ladder with a plasma torch. As they neared the door, the same thing happened as with the glass wall. About 5 feet out, the brilliant blue flame of the torch sputtered and died. Reignition failed. "No go, sir," one of them reported over his radio. "The ignition system shorts out when we get close." They tried a portable hydraulic spreader, the jaws of life. The moment its powerful carbide tips touched the metal of the door, a shower of blue sparks erupted, and the tool's motor whined to a halt dead. Matthews swore. "Is the damn thing electrified?" "Negative, sir," the engineer replied. "All our sensors are reading 0. It's not energized. It seems to be nullifying any complex system that touches it." We were cut off. The fortress we had breached was now sealed more tightly than ever. The ambient anxiety on the base curdled into a palpable sense of entrapment. Dr. Reed's theory was the one that stuck. We had broken the rules, invaded their space, and taken a component. The system, in response, had isolated itself to prevent further violation. "It's protecting itself," Davison said, his voice grim. "Or it's quarantining us," Reed countered quietly, her gaze drifting toward her lab. "With a lead-line box now Saturday, it's left us alone with the thing we took." Her words were chillingly prescient. By that evening, the first day of the lockdown, the cube was no longer inert. Ultra-sensitive microphones in the lab began detecting a subaudible vibration emanating from container. The frequency was incredibly low, barely within a range of our instruments, but it was a steady, rhythmic pulse. Then its temperature, already unnaturally cold, began to plummet. By nightfall, the lead container was covered in a thick layer of frost. Despite the lab's climate control, the cube was waking up, and so was the paranoia. That night, we had the first major incident. Not a panic attack, but something far more unnerving. Dr. Alastair Finch, one of the project's senior physicists, a quiet, gentle man in his late 50s, calmly walked out of his quarters and headed directly for the cordoned-off bunker entrance. He walked right past the perimeter guards, who were so taken aback by his serene confidence that they didn't react at first. He reached the open hatch, knelt, and pressed his ear against the cold concrete lip, as if listening for a distant train. When Matthews's men finally intercepted him, he offered no resistance. He just looked at them with a placid, empty expression and repeated a single phrase in a soft, monotone voice. "It needs to go back. The circuit is broken. It needs to go back." He spoke with the same flat, emotionless cadence as the voice that had spoken Liam's name. Finch was sedated and taken to the infirmary. That event terrified the staff more than any equipment failure. The threat was no longer some invisible, psychological pressure. It now had a voice. It had a purpose. It was giving orders. Day 2 began with a base-wide shelter-in-place order. No one was to leave their quarters without a direct command and a 3-person escort. The psychological pressure was immense. People were reporting hearing the low-frequency hum everywhere, a persistent thrum that seemed to drill directly into the skull. I sat in my module, staring at my hand-drawn schematic of the circuit board. It was the only tangible lead we had. I showed it to Davison and Reed. "If you're right," Reed said, tracing the lines with her finger, "then this chamber isn't a prison or a lab. It's a CPU of something far, far larger. And these vent shafts, they're the bus, the data conduits. They could extend for miles beyond the concrete box." The implication was horrifying. We thought we were working next to an anomaly. What if we built our entire base on it? What if this whole section of the Nevada desert was a dormant piece of alien machinery? We overlaid my drawing with the original GPR and seismic surveys. The patterns matched. Faint lines of anomalous soil density that had been written off as geological quirks perfectly aligned with the circuits I had sketched. The system was vast, and we were sitting at its heart. By the evening of the second day, the situation had deteriorated. The base's external communication systems failed. One by one, the satellite uplinks went dead. We were completely isolated. The infirmary now held 5 patients, all exhibiting the same symptoms as Dr. Finch, rocking back and forth in their beds, muttering about broken chains and incomplete patterns. I was in the lab with Dr. Reed, when it happened. We were observing the container. It was now encased in a block of ice, so thick it looked like a polar artifact. The low hum was a physical force, a vibration you could feel in your bones. Suddenly, on the cube's matte black surface, visible through a small, frost-free quartz window in the container, a thin line of light appeared. It glowed with a dim, crimson light, the exact same color as the light in the corridor. The line traced one edge of the cube for a split second, then vanished. "It's active," Reed whispered, her voice full of awe and terror. "It's establishing a connection. It's pinging something." We were watching a cold, dead object come to life. Exactly 48 hours to the minute after the door had sealed, everything stopped. The oppressive hum vanished. The vibrations ceased. A technician monitoring the cube sensor shouted, "Temperature is normalizing. The object is returning to an inert state." The thick ice on the container began to melt and drip onto the floor. Into the sudden, shocking silence, a voice crackled over the radio, loud and clear. It was the operator with the lonely job of watching the camera at the bottom of the ladder. "Command!" His voice was shaking with disbelief. "Command, you need to see this. Now." Davison, Reed, and I ran to the main monitor in the command post. The image was steady. The ladder, the landing, and the wall. Except it wasn't a wall anymore. The massive, impenetrable door was wide open. It stood just as it had before it slammed shut 2 days prior. Beyond it, the dark, silent maw of the corridor waited. No sound, no movement. It had simply opened. We stared at the screen, speechless. For 2 days, that door had been an absolute barrier. Now, it was an open invitation. And in that moment, the true, soul-crushing horror of our situation became clear. I looked at Davison, at Reed, and I saw the same terrible understanding dawning in her eyes as it was in my own. We had been so arrogant. We thought the system had locked itself to protect itself from us. But what if it was the other way around? It wasn't locking us out. It was locking itself in. It needed to perform some kind of internal process, a recalibration, a system reboot, triggered by the removal of the cube. And for that, it required total isolation. For 2 days, it was busy. Now it was finished, and it had opened the door. The question was no longer how we could get in. The question was what it was now ready to let out. Part 5. No one moved. We stood frozen in the command trailer, a silent, horrified audience to the image on the monitor. The open, black doorway at the bottom of the ladder. The base was unnaturally quiet. The glitches had stopped. The paranoia had evaporated. The whispers were gone. All that remained was a ringing silence, and that gaping invitation into the dark. Colonel Matthews was the first to break the paralysis, his military training taking over. He began issuing quiet, terse orders for his men to establish a fortified perimeter around the hatch. Not for an assault, but for containment. What's the play? I asked Davison, though I knew there was no playbook for this. He stared at the screen for a long time. "We have to know what changed," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "But I'm not sending anyone down there. Prep a drone. A small wheeled rover. The quietest one we've got. Cameras and atmospheric sensors only. No weapons." It took an hour. We prepped a small, ruggedized reconnaissance drone, no bigger than a shoebox. I volunteered to pilot it. I felt a grim obligation to see this to its conclusion. I sat at the control console in the now crowded trailer. Davison, Reed, and Matthew stood behind me, their faces illuminated by the screen showing the drone's eye view. Beginning descent, I announced. The little rover bumped carefully down the rungs of the ladder. It reached the bottom and rolled to a stop before the open doorway. So far, so good. Entering the corridor, I reported. The drone crossed the threshold. The corridor was the same, long, gray, sterile. But something was immediately, profoundly wrong. "Hold on," Dr. Reed said. "The lighting." She was right. The dim, ambient light from the ceiling was gone. The corridor was pitch black. We were seeing it only through the drone's powerful infrared camera. "Ambient temperature has dropped 15 degrees Celsius. A technician called out. "Humidity is at 0. The air is inert." I guided the drone forward, its rubber wheels silent on the smooth floor. The dead silence was the most unnerving part. The constant, low hum of the life support system was gone. The entire facility had been shut down. The drone traveled to 150 feet and stopped before the smoke glass wall. I angled the camera up to look into the room, and a collective gasp went through the trailer. It was empty. The 7 people, the metal stool, all of it was gone. The room had been stripped bare, as if it had been professionally cleared out and sterilized. The 7 individuals who had been in that room since 1974 had simply ceased to exist. Where did they go? Matthews breathed. There's no other exit. Scan the room, Jack, Davison ordered, his voice tight. Every wall. Slowly. I panned the drone's camera across the interior. The left wall was a smooth, unbroken surface. The right wall, the same. The glass partition was still there. Then I swung the camera to the far back wall, the one the man and woman had pressed their hands against. And we saw it. A perfect, rectangular doorway was now cut into that wall. It hadn't been there before. I knew that with absolute certainty. It wasn't a door in any conventional sense. It had no frame, no hinges, no handle. It was simply a hole in reality, an aperture leading into a darkness so complete, so absolute, that the drone's powerful infrared beam was simply swallowed by it, casting no light and reflecting nothing back. It was a rectangle of pure, featureless void. What is that? Reed's voice was a fragile whisper. No one had an answer. We were staring at the end of a journey. The room had never been a prison. It was a waiting room, an airlock, and the 7 people hadn't been prisoners. They were gatekeepers. Or perhaps they were the keys. The 2-day lockdown was the time it took for the lock to turn. Get the drone out of there, Davison said, his voice barely audible. Now. I turned the rover and drove it back down the dark, silent corridor. As it passed the ventilation grate we had breached, I angled the camera for a quick look. The tiny scratch marked the cube had left on the duct floor was gone. The metal was once again pristine. As the drone rolled back onto the landing at the bottom of the ladder, one final thing happened. With the same impossible smoothness and silence with which it had opened, the massive interior door slid shut behind it. A final, definitive thud echoed, a sound we heard clearly through the drone's microphone. The system had sealed itself. This time I knew it was for good. The next day, the base was decommissioned with terrifying speed and efficiency. A new, higher-level team of men in suits arrived and took over everything. All of us, myself, Davison, Reed, even Colonel Matthews, were individually escorted to a final debriefing. We were informed that for all official purposes, this investigation never happened. We had been part of a standard, successful site remediation project. Any statement to the contrary would be considered an act of treason, with all the finality that implies. The NDAs we signed this time were, essentially, our entire lives. They sent me home that evening on a non-commercial government flight. I never saw Davison or Dr. Reed again. My old company received a massive federal contract termination bonus and was strongly advised never to bid on government work in the Southwest again. It's been 6 months. I try to live a normal life, but I can't. I quit my job. I moved to a small town in Oregon where I don't know anyone. I lie awake at night, but there are no nightmares. There's just the ceiling and the thoughts. I don't know what we found out there in the desert, a failed experiment or a wildly successful one, an embassy, a tomb. But I know one last thing. Before they buried the whole site under 10,000 tons of concrete, I had one last hushed conversation with one of the junior lab technicians who had worked for Dr. Reed. He was young and terrified and needed to tell someone. He said that before Davison's men confiscated the cube, they ran one final high-resolution electron microscope scan on it. After the door in the bunker had opened and closed for the last time, a new mark had appeared on one of the cube's perfectly smooth faces. A tiny, almost invisible series of etched lines. It was a map, a star chart, highlighting a specific destination. It wasn't our solar system. The star it pointed to is in the constellation Ophiuchus, approximately 70 light-years from Earth. 70 light-years. The chamber was sealed in 1974. It takes light about 70 years to travel 70 light years. But the signal would have had to have been received, which means it was likely sent decades earlier. A simple calculation puts its departure from there to sometime in the early 1950s, just about the time we started splitting atoms in the desert and shouting our existence into the cosmos. It seems someone heard us. The message took a lifetime to arrive, and someone or something finally opened the door to receive it.